Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and today we are starting with a picture from the summer of 2002.
Right, I'm a resident expert, and I mean, this opening image really sets the stage. It's wild.
It is wild. So picture this. 1,000 desperate day laborers are marching on Hacienda Buenavista. That's an estate in the Cordoba province of southern Spain. And they're essentially occupying it to protest these massive government cuts to their unemployment checks.
Checks that were, like 129 euros a month?
Yeah, exactly.
What?
A remarkably meager 129 euros. But here is the kicker. The estate they were occupying belonged to the Duchess of Alba.
Oh, wow, the aristocrat.
Right, an aristocrat who owned, I think, something like 34,000 hectares of land across the country. And she was pulling in millions of euros in government agricultural subsidies every single year.
Millions. While the laborers are fighting for 129 euros.
Exactly. And so, how a stark, almost medieval-looking paradox like that manages to exist in modern 21st century Europe, well, that is the core mystery we are unspooling today.
Because, seeing that image of the laborers protesting on the Duchess's lawn, it shatters the conventional narratives we usually accept about progress, right? Like you see a clash like that, and you assume a catastrophic failure in the economic system just occurred.
Like some kind of accidental glitch in the modern welfare state.
Exactly. But today, we are diving into a deeply analytical text that flips that assumption completely upside down.
Yeah, we're looking at a fascinating study by Dr. Victor O. Martin. It's titled La Semifeudalidad y el atraso de España, el ejemplo del sur, or Semifeudalism and the backwardness of Spain, the example of the South.
And his thesis is highly provocative.
Yeah.
He argues that the historical poverty, the chronic unemployment, and the lack of development in regions like Andalusia and Extremadura, they are not the results of a failed capitalist system.
Right. He says they are the result of a highly successful, deliberately engineered system called semifeudalism.
But, it is important to establish the framework of this deep dive right away. The author employs a strict Marxist economic lens here.
Yes, very strict.
Right. He uses it to critique both the historical right-wing landowning elites of Spain and the modern left-wing government welfare policies operating there today. And we are not here to endorse these political viewpoints or take a side in that debate.
Right. Absolutely not taking sides. We are just impartially unpacking the author's structural analysis because the mechanics he describes, they provide this incredibly compelling way to read history and economics.
Totally. So to understand how the Duchess and those day laborers ended up in that 2002 standoff, the text takes us way back to how Spain supposedly transitioned out of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, the textbook version of history usually points to the 19th century and the bourgeois revolution. The standard narrative claims the old, stagnant aristocratic ways were swept aside.
Swept aside by a new class of profit-driven capitalist farmers who modernized everything.
Right, but the author dismantles that official narrative. He introduces this concept Lenin termed the Junker path, or the Prussian path of capitalist development.
And to understand the Prussian path, you really have to contrast it with the American path.
Like how things happened in the U.S.
Exactly. In a classic capitalist transition, like the American model, massive noble estates are forcibly broken up. The land is distributed or sold off to create this sprawling free market of small, independent family farms.
And then those independent farmers buy plows, seeds, consumer goods.
Right, which in turn fuels an industrial revolution and builds a middle class. The power and the land are dispersed.
But the text argues Spain completely bypassed that dispersal, like entirely.
It bypassed it intentionally. In the Prussian path, the massive estates are never broken up. Instead of the rising bourgeoisie destroying the old nobility, the two classes simply intermarry and merge.
Wow, so wealthy merchants buy their way into titles, and old aristocrats invest in merchant banks.
Exactly. They form a consolidated super elite. And critically, they keep the staggering sizes of their land holdings completely intact.
I like to think of it like a massive corporation upgrading its software, but, completely refusing to swap out the obsolete hardware.
That is a great way to put it.
Like, you look at the monitor, and the interface looks remarkably modern. You see capitalist terminology, written contracts, international markets, bank loans. But the underlying machinery running the whole operation, it's still operating on a brutal, aristocratic, feudal logic.
Yeah, and the author defines the output of that merged machinery as bureaucratic capitalism.
Yep.
It's a highly restricted, delayed form of capitalism, inextricably tied to state power and imperialism.
And the most vital takeaway from his analysis of this bureaucratic capitalism is that the development of true productive forces, things like agricultural technology, logistical efficiency, or an educated workforce, it was deliberately stunted.
Deliberately, which, I mean, sounds completely counterintuitive.
Right, because if you are the ruling elite, wouldn't you want your region to be as advanced and wealthy as possible?
Not if true development threatens your monopoly on
Oh,
power.
of course.
Yeah, true capitalist development in agriculture would have required creating a free labor market and empowering a middle class of independent farmers. And a wealthy, educated middle class eventually demands political representation.
They demand fairer laws and an end to aristocratic privilege. So by intentionally stunting the economic development of southern Spain, the merged elite maintained absolute, unquestioned authority over a desperate population.
Precisely. Whenever you encounter a system that appears wildly inefficient, whether you're looking at 19th century European agriculture, a modern corporate structure, or, a confusing government policy, the most clarifying question you can ask is, who actually benefits from this inefficiency?
Who benefits? Because the lack of development in Andalusia wasn't a bug, it was the central design feature of the ruling class.
Which forces us to look at the actual accounting of this system. If these massive landowners aren't using capitalist tools like investment and technological efficiency to generate their wealth, where's the money actually coming from?
Right. And the author explains this by diving into the Marxist theory of land rent and the concept of surplus product. Let's define surplus product mechanically to see how this works on the ground.
Okay, imagine a peasant farmer working a plot of land. Over the course of a year, that peasant grows, let's say, 100 kilos of wheat.
Okay, 100 kilos.
Now, to feed his family and physically survive until the next harvest, he needs to consume 20 kilos. The remaining 80 kilos represent the surplus product.
Got it. And under a functioning capitalist system, a significant portion of that surplus is reinvested back into the farm, right?
Exactly. The capitalist sells the surplus to buy better fertilizer, a more advanced plow, or to hire additional free wage laborers to clear more land,
Oh.
all aiming to produce 200 kilos the following year.
But the text argues that under semifeudalism, the landowner extracts that wealth in a completely different manner. They don't absorb the surplus product to improve the land.
No, they extract it almost entirely as rent, or through what the author calls labor payment, pago en trabajo.
So the landowner takes the 80 kilos of surplus, uses it to fund a lavish lifestyle in a palace in Madrid or Seville, and leaves the peasant with exactly the 20 kilos needed to not starve.
Yeah, and the farm itself sees zero improvement. The technology remains identical for centuries.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because this is where the logic of the wealthy elite seems to break down for me.
Oh, so?
Well, if I own a colossal estate of 10,000 hectares, why wouldn't I want to buy tractors and modern irrigation systems? If I mechanize my farm, I could grow 1,000 kilos of wheat instead of 100, and I could buy 5 palaces in Madrid.
Right, that makes logical sense on paper.
Yeah, why rely on squeezing starving peasants for rent when modernization would make me infinitely richer?
It sounds like the obvious choice, but the author highlights a brilliant economic reality here. Investing in tractors and irrigation requires massive capital outlay, and more importantly, it introduces risk. Right. You have to take out loans, manage complex machinery, and risk financial ruin if the market drops or the harvest fails. The semi-feudal system of extracting rent requires absolutely zero investment.
And carries zero risk for the landowner, because they bypass the risk by rigging the legal and social framework.
Yes. The author points to the use of extra economic coercion. Landowners weren't relying on the free market. They used the law, political monopolies, the civil guard, and arbitrary fines to keep workers physically tied to the territory.
Because as long as the elite maintained a massive captive reserve of desperate, cheap labor, the pago and trabajo system was vastly more profitable than taking the risks of modern farming.
Exactly. If you possess an endless supply of human beings willing to break their backs for practically nothing just to survive the winter, buying a tractor is a foolish expense. You simply use your political power to keep their wages below survival levels.
Ensuring you extract maximum surplus, you are extracting wealth entirely from their desperation rather than from the productivity of the soil.
It's grim, but it's incredibly effective.
And this theoretical framework gets intensely visceral when the text maps it onto the physical geography of southern Spain. It manifests in this notorious trap between the latifundio, the massive aristocratic estates, and the minifundio.
The tiny, fragmented, almost useless plots of land.
Right. And historically, economists tend to view massive estates and tiny peasant plots as opposing agrarian models. Like a region is usually categorized by one or the other.
But the text emphasizes that in Andalusia and Extremadura, the latifundio and the minifundio grew together symbiotically.
Symbiotically.
Yeah, the proliferation of tiny fragmented plots wasn't an accident of inheritance or bad geography. It was a highly calculated weapon deployed by the elites.
Oh, wow. And the author details this incredible example from 19th century Seville involving the Vasquez family. They were the prototypical new agrarian elite, blending old money with new bourgeois status.
Right, and in 1873, estate records show the Vasquez family actively leased out tiny, highly marginal plots of rocky land on the absolute fringes of their massive estate.
To 49 different tenant families.
49 families. And on paper, or to an outside observer, that might look like charity, right? The wealthy landowner distributing land to the poor.
But the text reveals it was the exact opposite of charity. It was a predatory practice called microarrendamento, or microleasing. We need to look at the physical reality of what those 49 families endured.
They are granted maybe half a hectare of terrible rocky soil.
Right, so they spend 10 months of the year doing back-breaking labor just to yield enough calories to keep their children from starving. Because the plot is so small and the soil so poor, they can never produce a surplus.
Never. They can never save money, buy better tools, or afford to move away.
They are physically anchored to the border of the Vasquez estate. The plot is perfectly calibrated, big enough to keep them alive, but entirely too small to ever make them financially independent.
And that calibration pays off for the Vasquez family when the harvest season arrives. For those 2 critical months of the year, the massive estate needs hundreds of hands to bring in the crops.
Because of microarrendamiento, the estate has a captive labor force of 49 desperate families living right on the property line.
Exactly. The tenants have no choice but to cross over and work the harvest for absolute pennies because they have zero negotiating power and zero alternatives.
I mean, it is a breathtakingly insidious piece of social engineering. By giving a laborer a taste of land, you trick them into funding their own survival for 10 months of the year.
Which relieves the wealthy landowner of the obligation to pay a year-round living wage. The landowner guarantees an on-demand, hyper-cheap labor supply with zero overhead.
And the text documents several variations of this mechanism, right?
Oh yeah. In Extremadura, they utilized the sonara. This was a practice where a tiny piece of land was given to a worker in lieu of a cash salary.
Payment in land usage completely removes money from the equation. It isolates the worker from the broader capitalist economy and ties them even tighter to the local lord.
The author also brings up figures like the Duke of Frias and the Marquis of La Romana. Those examples demonstrate just how deep the extra economic coercion went.
Well into the late 19th and even early 20th centuries.
Right. These aristocrats maintained ancestral, almost medieval rights to collect taxes in conturation, meaning a percentage of actual agricultural products from entire independent villages.
Treating the land and the people on it not as elements of a productive agricultural business, but as mechanisms for social subjugation. It was a constant physical reminder of who owned the surplus.
So the south of Spain is effectively locked in a state of engineered underdevelopment by this heavily fortified semi-feudal hardware.
But, you know, I imagine anyone listening and looking at modern European history is thinking, okay, the 19th century was brutal. But the 20th century brought massive industrial booms, the fall of dictatorships, the rise of modern democracy, the European Union.
Right. Surely this semi-feudal trap was finally broken.
That is the logical assumption to make.
Yeah.
You expect the introduction of modern democratic institutions and globalized markets to just shatter that old hardware.
But the author's analysis takes a fascinating, deeply practical turn here. He argues the system was never broken, it merely adapted its camouflage to survive the modern era.
And to see how it adapted, we have to look at the massive demographic earthquake of the 1960s and 70s. During the 60s, Spain underwent rapid, explosive industrialization.
However, the factories and the economic booms were heavily concentrated in the north, places like Catalonia and the Basque Country, and in major cities or even abroad in places like Germany.
For the first time in centuries, the desperately poor rural laborers of the South had a viable escape route. They began fleeing the countryside en masse to take factory jobs.
And that demographic shift triggered a massive crisis for the old semi-feudal system. The foundational pillar of their wealth, that unlimited captive supply of incredibly cheap labor, was suddenly drying up.
As the workers left, the power dynamic shifted. Wages for the laborers who remained in the countryside began to spike.
This sounds like the classic adapt or die moment in any capitalist economy, right?
It really does. The old extra economic coercion, the vagrancy laws, the threat of starvation, they are losing their grip. I would assume the latifundistas were finally backed into a corner and forced to become true capitalists. Like, did they finally buy the tractors and mechanize the South?
Well, they attempted to adapt, but they hit a geographical and technological wall. They aggressively mechanized the crops that allowed for it, like planting vast fields of wheat or sunflowers which could be handled by a few men and some combine harvesters.
But Andalusia's most lucrative and famous crop is the olive.
Exactly. In the 1960s and 70s, and even today, in the steep, rugged, hilly terrain of the South, you cannot easily drive a massive harvesting machine through an olive grove.
So the elite still absolutely required manual labor human hands to carefully harvest the olives during a few intense, chaotic months of the year.
So the fundamental contradiction remains. They desperately need a seasonal army of cheap labor, but they no longer possess the feudal tools, the arbitrary laws, or the local police force to physically chain people to the villages.
The workers now have the option to move to Barcelona. How does an elite class keep a labor force tied to the land when the old chains are gone?
The author argues they outsourced the coercion. They swapped the old physical tools of feudalism for the bureaucratic tools of the modern political state.
And this brings us to the most controversial and practical focus of the author's work, the creation of modern state welfare subsidies.
The text meticulously details the evolution of these programs, starting with the Empleo Comunitario in the 1970s, which eventually morphed into the famous PR, the Plan de Empleo Rural, and later the AEPSA.
On the surface, these are unemployment subsidies designed specifically for agricultural day laborers in Andalusia and Extremadura. If you read the press releases or the official legislation, these programs sound like incredibly progressive, compassionate, left-wing policies designed to protect the rural poor from the harsh realities of seasonal agricultural work.
But the author applies his strict Marxist lens to analyze not the intent of the legislation, but the actual structural function it serves in the economy. He concludes that these modern welfare subsidies are the direct bureaucratic evolution of semifeudalism.
Wow. Let's trace the mechanics of this subsidy to see how welfare becomes a tool of the elite. To qualify for this state subsidy, that €129 a month we mentioned at the start, the rural laborers have to jump through specific bureaucratic hoops.
The crucial mechanism is the requirement of peonadas. To receive the state unemployment money for the months when there is no work, a laborer must prove they have worked a minimum number of days, the peonadas, during the agricultural harvest.
Usually this means working on the massive estates of the latifundistas during the olive harvest.
Right. And the implication of that requirement is staggering. The state is essentially stepping in to pay the maintenance cost of the elite's labor force.
The government taxes the broader population and uses that money to pay the day laborers just enough to survive in their rural villages for the 9 or 10 months of the year when the estates don't need them.
Exactly. The welfare check replaces the tiny plot of rocky land from the 19th century. It serves the exact same function as microarrendamiento. It anchors the population to the geography.
So the subsidy ensures that when the Duchess of Alba or any massive landowner needs hundreds of people to pick olives in December, there is a captive, economically dependent workforce waiting in the village.
Desperate to log their peonadas to secure their subsidy for the rest of the year, the landowner gets a guaranteed hyper-cheap labor pool, but never has to take on the financial burden of paying those workers a year-round living wage.
That is a phenomenal sleight of hand. The author argues that by instituting these subsidies, the political class effectively bypassed the need for a true agrarian reform.
A genuine agrarian reform would have required confronting the latifundistas. It would have meant expropriating the massive estates, breaking them up, and redistributing the wealth and the land to the workers, finally completing the bourgeois revolution that Spain missed in the 19th century.
But confronting the elite carries immense political risk. So instead of giving the laborers the land, the system just put the laborers on the state payroll.
It pacified the immediate threat of protests and starvation. It removed the pressure to modernize or distribute the land, and it perfectly preserved the historical power, property, and profit margins of the aristocratic elites.
The coercion simply evolved from being extra economic and physical to being bureaucratic and political.
The hardware never crashed. It just received a modern, democratic interface. The mechanisms of semifeudalism extracting surplus without investment and tying a captive population to the land are still operating, fully subsidized by the modern taxpayer.
Which brings us precisely back to the stunning paradox of our opening image. In 2002, when 1,000 day laborers marched on the Duchess of Alba's estate, they were not demanding that her 34,000 hectares be broken up and given to them.
They were protesting government cuts to the PER subsidy.
Exactly. They were literally fighting to maintain the very bureaucratic leash that the author argues was designed by the elite to keep them trapped as a permanent seasonal labor reserve.
When you look at the events of 2002 through the author's analytical framework, it is no longer a medieval paradox or a glitch in the system. It is a testament to the durability of the Prussian path.
We have traced how an incomplete economic transition in the 19th century allowed a merged elite to deliberately stunt regional development.
We've explored how the mechanics of Marxist land rent made stagnation wildly profitable.
And we have seen how the elites navigated the demographic crisis of the 1960s by transforming a feudal labor trap into a modern political welfare system. It is an incredibly powerful framework for analyzing the world.
It really is. It proves that when you are looking at any stagnating economy, any chronically impoverished region, or any confusing political policy, you must look far beyond the superficial intentions or the public relations of the interface.
Chronic inefficiency is almost never an accident or a mistake. It is usually a carefully maintained, highly profitable structure designed to protect the power of those at the top.
And investigating the underlying hardware usually reveals exactly who is collecting the rent.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you navigate your own understanding of modern economics. We spent this deep dive exploring how a supposedly progressive welfare subsidy in southern Spain actually functions as a hidden mechanism of aristocratic preservation.
Right.
If the author's structural analysis holds true, it forces a deeply uncomfortable question for all of us. How many other modern safety nets, social programs, or welfare policies in our own societies are secretly designed not to lift people out of poverty, but to trap them just above the starvation line, ensuring they remain an available, permanently cheap resource for the people who own the estates?